Hello, my name is Miranda Carboo-Brown. I'm from PwC's Risk Consulting Practice. I'm delighted today to be joined by Nick Silitch, Chief Risk Officer at Prudential Financial. Hello, Nick. How's it going?
You know, it's after 9 months of living the dream. It's we're still in a pretty good place, all things considered. So, well, I would say.
Definitely. So I'm going to take you through a few questions just to understand your experiences as a Chief Risk Officer in what has been an unprecedented year. I think that's the buzzword of the 2020. So I'll dive straight in. So on that topic of being an intense year, 2020 has been, it goes without saying, an intense year for all of us. What are your hopes and fears for 2021?
Well, my hopes, I would say, is that we get a vaccine. It starts, the vaccines start working. No negative events happen in the early incubation of the vaccine. We start pushing it out through distribution, and that by July or August of 2021, we're back in a world where we could consider going back to, I will say, business as usual.
Yeah.
That business as usual will change a great deal, but for a lot of other reasons, because we've all changed the way we work and the way we think about working remotely in technology. But I think I would hope that if it would give us the opportunity, if we did all decide to go back into London or New York every day and whatever, that we all could do that. That would be my hope. My fear is that I guess it's less about something bad happening to one of the vaccines. It's more about the fact that there's some kind of trigger globally that makes the financial markets get jittery and nervous, and that there's some kind of a fundamental revaluation. I think it's unlikely with the $20 trillion of money supply that we have. Literally, money supply has grown by $5 trillion in 2 years. That money has to go somewhere, and I think it's going into asset valuations. A lot of it is. So I think it's unlikely, but the fear is that the bloom comes off the rose somehow, and real volatility comes back in the financial markets.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I guess linked to that, how did your experiences of being a Chief Risk Officer during the pandemic change your view on the concepts around risk leadership and risk management?
I actually think now I'm older than most folks here. This is my fourth one of these crises. And as a result of that, I think it's what I've learned in the previous three that have actually put us in a situation where we were fundamentally prepared. We had stress tests that absolutely envisioned what we're going through today. In fact, far worse. And we integrated them with our capital regimes, and we have playbooks of how to react to these situations. So I feel like it was all of the experience in the years before this that gave us the perspective to be able to think about this current version in the right way. Now, is it unprecedented? Yes. But is it something that was impossible to imagine if you went back to 1918 and looked at what happened during the pandemic and the Spanish flu?
Yes.
No, it's not impossible. And so the preparing yourself for what might happen, makes the journey down that path as it's happening far less fearful. So you sort of say, that's a really steep step, but I know I can take it. And that's different than, oh my gosh, can I make it?
Absolutely. Definitely a piece there around lessons learned, really. And I guess thinking about forward looking, what do you think the next big innovation or game changer in risk management will be?
I don't think risk management has always been about information. And I think that we've had innovations in information and data compilation. I would say back in the 80s, we came up with the fact that we could now model stochastically interest rate evolutions and market risk. That was a huge move forward. And then by the early 90s, or I guess, early 90s, KMV came in and started thinking you could stochastically model credit portfolios, and that starts working as well. And so we had real movements forward that were tools that changed, but the drive and all of it because data became so much more available. I think in the financial markets, the data we're awfully good there. Will there be a sea change at some point that happens in our financial markets, the way we think about them from a risk perspective? I don't think so. I think the biggest risk on the financial side is that the playground we're playing on changes, right? Yes. So we're in a world where we think corporate defaults happen, where businesses get in trouble. We have recently emerged, the Chrysler bailout in 1979 was unprecedented. In the UK, you all, about the same time frame, you did the Rolls-Royce bailout, or the Rover bailout, I guess. Those made sense at the time for limited purposes. We have now taken that notion and applied it broadly across a lot of capital of the Western world, which is where capitalism exists and was born. And I think the dangers of that are that capitalism down the road, the nature of it starts to change, and that failure becomes something that isn't necessarily an outcome of making mistakes. And I think we still have it. I think we still have it in the technology world, where startups come and they go every night, and failure comes with a harsh sentence. And you need to innovate and adapt when you fail. In a lot of the larger, more established parts of our economy, failure is frequently given alternative outcomes. And so I just think with the federal and policy bailouts, and I think at some point that might change the game we're playing. So that's the one thing. The other thing where I think it might really change is that place where information hasn't always been available and isn't yet really good is on the operational risk front. And I think that there's real room for all of us to start bringing data capture and data analytics to bear on our core underlying operations. And if we do that, we can reduce the people component of life and make everybody an analyst instead of a processor. And I think that would be beneficial to all of us, and certainly be a better outcome, allow us to do a better job of managing operational risk.
So moving now on to climate change risk, Nick, we can see that it's gaining greater and greater prominence. So in your view, how can risk management better understand, manage, and model this risk going forward?
That's a fascinating question. It's something that is, you're right, becoming increasingly relevant. I would not say because it's becoming more prominent. I'd say because we're getting closer and closer to the tipping point of when it really matters. This is a risk that started mattering at the onset of the Industrial Revolution in 1680 or whatever it was. People have different ideas of when that actually started, but it really accelerated in 1890. And with it came growth in population. In 1890, we first reached a global population of 1 billion people. Yeah. It was 1929 before we got to the 2nd billion. And in the last go round, I think it took 12 years to get to an additional billion. We're now at 8 billion people. So the Industrial Revolution and all that came with it has dramatically enhanced the ability of the Earth to sustain human population. That's terrific. The downside is it's come with a lot of other byproducts as well. We have the carbon counts, if you look and see what started happening really in the early 1900s, but has accelerated post-World War II and now is on a trajectory straight to the heavens. We're at a point where sustainability is really an issue and really at risk. If we had picked up on this in 1950 or even 1970, we could have built a long, sustainable path to avoid that tipping point and to make it all seem quite rational in the path that we go from A to B. Instead, what politicians and what we broadly like to do as society, human beings are oriented towards, sating whatever their short-term needs are. we're not terribly good. We're great at survival when it's really pushy, but we're really thinking about it day by day. And this is something where we have to forego current pleasures and ease in order to create a sustainable environment for our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And that's a much harder trade-off for the human condition to make. It's not natural for us. So part of that is something that we would lean on our politicians for, but politicians need to be elected. And so they have to kind of focus on the short term. So we've been doing that for a long time. And it's going to be hard to make it. So I think the economic outcomes as we move through the next 30 years, if I were to look at business models without any policy changing, I would say that the environment would be not something too challenging to deal with because the evolution will take place gradually. But with the onset of policy is likely to go from having been almost non-existent for 30 years where it should have been existent, maybe even 50 years where it should have been existent, and people should have been talking about this, to probably getting to a point where we're going to react very quickly and maybe overreact. Yeah. And how you try to model the impact of what those policy outcomes might be is almost impossible. We don't know. Is there a world where fossil fuels could be outlawed? Potentially. What happens to the world in that environment? I don't know. It gets tricky fast, right? I mean, if we create a sustainable path to those places, those types of energy being far less relevant, that's a different question. So how do you work towards a long-term evolution of this? The economics would be a 20 or 30-year evolution. The policy intermediary steps are likely to be far more volatile and harder to project. Yeah. And as are the reactions of other stakeholders, shareholders and other folks. The cost of capital for fossil fuels versus renewable energy sources, the differential is already large and it's probably going to continue to gap, which will That in a way is one of those sustainable outcomes. That just creates good incentives for people to move. However, if that cost of capital is so out of whack, and then it corrects, you're going to find a lot of people getting hurt on both sides. So I think that it'd be lovely if we had a global group getting together and putting long-term sustainable solutions for this problem together. Yeah. I think that's unlikely, and we'll continue to move down this somewhat disjointed path that we're on, and the best we can do to make sure that we protect ourselves as chief risk officers and as financial institutions is to make sure we think about all the outcomes that might be on the potential list and make sure we can survive those.
So thank you so much, Nick, for sharing your experiences as a Chief Risk Officer in what can only be described as an unprecedented year. It's been really, really, really intriguing and interesting to hear what has been happening.